The member for Melbourne has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Official data released today shows emissions have just gone up by 2% under your government. But the Independent Climate Targets Panel has determined that for Australia to meet the Glasgow Climate Pact requirement to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, emissions must be cut by at least 74% by 2030. Given Australia will be required to update our targets in Egypt next year, will you take a 75% by 2030 target to the next election? Or is the only way we're going to get science-based climate targets to kick your terrible government out and put the Greens in balance of power?
The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister has the call. Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order.
I thank the Shadow Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, in what hopes to be a Green Labor government, Mr. Speaker, after the next election. That's what they hope for. They're calling themselves shadow ministers down there in the Greens, Mr. Speaker. I tell you what, they'll never be in an alignment with this government, Mr. Speaker. There will never be, and there never has been, Mr. Speaker, a Liberal Nationals Green government. But, Mr. Speaker, I do know that the Labor Party did a deal in government with the Greens to bring in the carbon tax. I know they formed an alliance with the Greens, Mr. Speaker, last time they were in the government. I remember the photo. It was almost, Mr. Speaker, as shameful as the photo we saw with the former Leader of the Opposition measuring up the curtains before the last election with all the hubris, Mr. Speaker. So there they are, getting ready, Mr. Speaker, thinking the Greens and Labor are going to walk onto the Treasury benches of this country.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. 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 Members on my right. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr. Speaker. Well, hang on. Sit down.
I'm still hearing.
You sit down, Buffett. You sit down. I've got the
Leader
call.
of the House will
I've got the call. Sit down.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order of relevance.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. On relevance, the only coalition in this parliament is the rabble over there.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, if there was a standing order on glass jaws, he would be in order. Clearly, there is
Leader
not,
of the House,
and he should be sat down.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. Order. The question asked by the member for Melbourne was extraordinarily broad, and I would ask the Prime Minister to return to the dispatch box.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note that the Leader of the Opposition takes objection to the suggestion that the Greens and Labor would actually form a coalition. Now, where would I get that idea from, Mr. Speaker? They actually did it, Mr. Speaker. They actually did it when they were last in government. And I remember many years ago when Lindsay Tanner, the former member for Melbourne, Mr. Speaker, the former member for Melbourne said, I think it was before the 2004 election, Mr. Speaker, and he said, you know, if it's a close election, we might have to do some of the crazy things the Greens want us to do, Mr. Speaker. That's what the former member for Melbourne says, and now a Greens member sits in that former Labor seat, just as a Greens leader would seek to sit in a Labor government, Mr. Speaker. So I can tell the member that under our government, Mr. Speaker, emissions have fallen by over 20%, Mr. Speaker. Under our government, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that we have a target for 2030, which we took to the Australian people at the last election, and we will meet and beat, and we'll see emissions fall by 35% by 2030. The Labor Greens target, Mr. Speaker, not set yet. They still haven't told you what they want to do in 2030. There's no plan for 2030. There's no plan for 2050. We've been very clear that we will do this through technology, not taxes, but Labor, forced by the Greens, will tax you on that issue.